just to keep to our schedule, we're going to move to the last presenter, who is Pam Bowen, a senior policy advisor at the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK. We're very happy to have you on board, as the UK has been very impressive, I think, in its work to address exploitation and modern slavery already for quite a long time. And one could perhaps say that the UK is in many respects ahead of the rest of Europe in this sense. And we're particularly intrigued by the victim-sensitive investigation and prosecution strategy that you're going to present to us, and we hope to learn from your experiences. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event, but also to confirm that our issues are very similar to those issues that were outlined earlier by Peter from Belgium, and in particular the impact of COVID pandemic, not only on the changing profile of exploitation, but also movement between different sectors and victims who were perhaps once exploited in a different type of exploitation now being moved to all different types of labour exploitation. But the most significant impact has been on our criminal justice system, and there's a sort of significant backlogs of cases awaiting trial, and obviously it impacts as well on investigations. So moving on from there, though, we have two offences in the United Kingdom. So if you could put next slide up, please, under which we can prosecute forced labour. So the first one is human trafficking, and that is for the purposes of slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labour. And then under the same legislation, we have a standalone offence of slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labour. So this second offence has actually proved very, very useful when it isn't possible to evidence the trafficking or to prosecute where victims have been held in slavery for many decades, which all predated the introduction of our trafficking legislation. And as you'll see sort of later on when I show some of the data, how much more significantly now we are using that offence rather than trafficking offence. So of note, though I haven't included it on the slide, there is also a provision in our Modern Slavery Act that requires companies to publish what steps they've taken to ensure transparency in supply chains. It doesn't have much impact on prosecutors as it doesn't carry sanctions. However, any investigations into a company where exploited labour is being used may potentially result in a referral for prosecution, although large corporates are often very difficult to attribute the necessary knowledge and controlling mind of the company directors. But also we have offences for regulatory breaches of gangmaster labour abuse authority breaches, tax frauds, money laundering and benefit fraud. So all of those different offences can be used in these cases. So the types of cases we prosecute under these two different offences and why. So if you could have next slide, please. So first of all, the trafficking offence. So it's trafficking and exploitation of migrant labour. Predominantly, the victims are from Eastern European countries who are trafficked into work and jobs they were not expecting to do, and for which generally they are not paid. Usually the types of work they're doing is working very low paid or low level work in recycling centres, factories, food packaging industries, car washes. Their wages are withheld and to pay for their travel and accommodation. Accommodation is often very squalid. They're given very little to eat. Sometimes they have to go begging or scraping around in the recycling bins that they're actually working on. Often they're subject to threats, use of violence, and have no opportunity to change their situations. And we will usually prosecute these cases for the offence of trafficking for forced labour. Next slide, please. So they're just a couple of issues of the sort of the migrant labour cases that we prosecute. Next slide, please. So the other type of labour exploitation, it is fairly common in the United Kingdom, where cases have been prosecuted involving what we call Irish travellers who have kept recruited and kept vulnerable British males in slavery for many years, and in fact sometimes decades. I think the case that we prosecuted where there was the longest slavery was 40 years. So the victims are generally homeless, chaotic men with mental health issues, learning difficulties, and often drug and alcohol addiction. They're used to often carry out domestic building, so roofing, paving driveways for no wages. They're often accommodated in squalid, dilapidated caravans and are tied to those who use them as slaves. They're generally paid in alcohol and become institutionalized following decades of being kept in slavery. We've had one case where the men were required to shave their heads and they had numbers tattooed on them. So, it really was like sort of ancient slavery from many centuries ago. Next slide, please. So they're just a couple of images from a case we prosecuted. The interior of these dilapidated caravans they were living in and had been for decades were just so squalid and abysmal. And as you can see from the second image, often sent out to do things like roofing without any proper equipment or health and safety guidance. So next slide, please. So in taking a victim-centred approach in accordance with our international obligations to prevent re-victimisation of victims by not requiring them to give evidence, these are a number of ways in which we can minimise their trauma. So first of all, prosecutors will work closely with law enforcement with proactive investigations to provide significant independent evidence which can support the offence and remove the burden of proving the offences from the victim. Those proactive investigations to evidence an offence also may require that the victim doesn't have to provide testimony at all if we can gather enough independent evidence. Quite often visual evidence is absolutely vital. So things like body-worn videos of law enforcement when they go into sites, the accommodation, or into the working arrangements, where we can see the really poor situation that they're living and working in, and contrast that often with images of the lifestyle of the perpetrators. And this can be quite compelling, more so than just witness testimony, where the court and juries can actually see the horrendous sort of circumstances in which they're living. So pre-recorded evidence and cross-examination of victims is also a way in which we can ensure that we capture the evidence of victims and witnesses to play before a court. And we've now have rollout of pre-recorded cross-examination of victims. So that means that within a few weeks of charges against a defendant, the victim can be cross-examined by video by the defence, and that can be captured and played at the time of trial rather than the victims hanging around, and particularly during the backlogs of cases that we're experiencing because of COVID. That is sort of an ideal way of ensuring that we've got all the evidence so the victims can either move on with their lives or return to their home countries. All of that we can use as well as special measures. So evidence can be given through live links from either a remote destination or a live link from overseas if the witnesses have returned home. Use of interpreters, obviously, and increasingly because of the mental health situation of victims and their sort of chaotic lifestyles, we have what we call now ground rule hearings, which is where we make an application to the judge ahead of the trial to ask the judge to put down some rules as to how a victim should be examined or cross-examined. So rather than the defence sort of having leading questions or rolling a lot of questions into one, having very, very short questions and answers so that the victim doesn't get confused. We also employ intermediaries who can assist victims if they have mental health issues in the preferred way of actually communicating. And both of these provisions have enabled us to prosecute a lot more cases where victims otherwise may not have been able to give a coherent account of what's happened to them. Next slide, please. So, and investigations, I'm sure you've heard already from sort of the other panels. Obviously, covert surveillance is vital in these cases, including cameras to record events at sites, use of material and downloads from digital devices, financial investigations, flight manifests where victims are trafficked in, closed circuit TV, joint investigations and assistance from overseas where victims have been brought in, but also the support of a whole range of law enforcement agencies. So there's be police, maybe National Crime Agency, the Gangmaster Labour Abuse Authority, Revenue and Customs, the Department for Works and Pensions, particularly where traffickers will also claim state benefits for their victims. We can also employ expert evidence, which can either be used as an investigative tool or the experts can be used to give evidence at court. Use of reception centres on the day of the police action or raids to triage victims to respond to their immediate needs for medical attention. They may be suffering from malnutrition, regularised immigration status, bathing and clothing, and also to record their details and refer them to relevant sort of and tailored ongoing support. Next slide, please. So this is our very last slide. And it's like an eye test, I think, to sort of see it because it's quite small. But these are the sort of numbers and the various legislation under which we can prosecute. So the Coroners and Justice Act, or the Asylum and Immigration Treatment of Claimants Act, which has got declining numbers because it was an old piece of legislation for which we used to prosecute trafficking for labour exploitation. Underneath that, the Coroners and Justice Act, again declining because that has now been repealed, but that introduced the standalone offence of slavery. And then what you'll see next online is the Section 1 of the Modern Slavery Act. And you can see there the sort of steep incline or increase of the number of prosecutions now we're bringing for slavery alone, which is sort of 45 in September 2017, leaping up to 80, and in the last year, 158. And then the trafficking for all forms of exploitation for which we cannot disaggregate, unfortunately, labour exploitation. And in fact, that is declining in the way against sort of the way in which the slavery offences are increasing. So that is a very rapid run through. I'm sorry I've overrun a little bit, but thank you very much for listening to me. And if I can answer any questions later, I'm very happy to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam, so much for a very interesting presentation. I open the floor for any questions or comments. Please feel free to ask for the floor.
I've got a question for Pam. It's Steve from Gangmasters.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Pam, hi. Thanks for the input. Obviously, I've made a few comments there around labour management, enforcement undertakings, and other tools that we can utilise as an investigating agency. Obviously, modern slavery, human trafficking investigations, by their very nature, are complex and time-consuming, and the years. We currently have a few investigations on the go, and the biggest problem that is rapidly approaching us is the issue of cross-border inquiries in Europe, so European investigation orders. And I'm led to believe that we're kind of all in the same boat because we don't know what's going to happen in the new year. And there's various options. You know, it may revert back to the old-fashioned letters of request. I just wondered, are you able to give an update on that? Sorry if that's putting you on the spot a little bit.
Well, I could go on for another hour here, but very briefly, we still don't know whether we're leaving with or without a deal. And so we've obviously had to put in place contingency arrangements so that come the 31st of December, when we eventually find out what's happening, we have got fallback positions. What we have done from a prosecution point of view is to increase resilience by placing more prosecutors across Europe. So in each EU member state where we have a lot more cases, and we've got sort of bespoke modern slavery advisors, criminal justice advisors in the countries from which we have the sort of the greater number of victims coming across. So they will be able to help us in sort of finding our way through the sort of minefields in each country, where previously we may have had to rely on Eurojust. We, in terms of the European investigation orders and EAW and also obviously sort of letters of request, again, we don't know yet, whether we'll be able to use all of those, or whether we will have to rely on the clunky 1959 convention in order to enable us to sort of obtain the evidence that we need from other countries. So sorry if that is not a very helpful response, but we're as much in the dark as I think everybody else across Europe.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, it seems very complex and complicated. I know Annina sent me a message. You have a question. Would you like to ask it, Annina?
Yes, thank you all for the great presentations. I had a question first to Pam. So I was interested in, you mentioned that it is possible to prosecute without the victim story and use this other evidence. So I was just wondering if you've had successful convictions on human trafficking in the UK without the kind of testimony of the victim or their full cooperation.
Yes, we have. We've in fact we're increasingly bringing more evidence-led prosecutions now. Evidence-led means victimless, and that is right across all exploitation types. So where we can gather evidence, usually from digital devices or using website platforms. So by way of example, whilst it's more common for sexual exploitation, we have arrangements with adult services websites where we can sort of collect intelligence from victims. So using data wash, data wash applications, we can go through profiles on a website and identify those where there are sort of commonalities between the victims' profiles, which may suggest that one person is actually putting up all of the profiles. And then we have arrangements with the directors from those companies whereby we can ask them for details of the person who put up that profile, which would include their credit card number, a sort of mobile phone number, as well as their email address. So using the credit card details, we can access then financial investigation. Financial investigation can lead to evidence of flight manifests. And in that way, we can build a case without actually even identifying or relying on any of the victims. In addition to which we use downloads from mobile phones. There's an awful lot of digital material on there. For sort of criminal exploitation. So we have a massive issue in the United Kingdom of criminal exploitation through county lines, which is sort of plugging children with drugs and sending them around the country. And so far, we've prosecuted all of those cases without any child victims having to give evidence, but just relying on sort of CCTV evidence, mobile phone downloads, cell site analysis, and call analysis, call data. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Any further comments or questions?
Yes, so I also had a question to Peter. When we were in Brussels, we were very impressed with the structures you have in place for this cooperation between different actors. And I just wanted to ask from you, Peter, do you also cooperate with the prosecutors during the investigation phase? And since it's in the structures, I assume that it's easier to cooperate rather than that it's like individual persons that are doing the job. As you mentioned, you have these local teams in place that work together and cooperate. Thank you.
This is a very interesting question, Anina. We constantly work together with prosecutors because, as I explained, they are really the hub of the whole scheme. They gather all kinds of information. Sometimes we just have only one piece of that puzzle. That's the information that we gather. We report that to the prosecutor, but at the same time, he receives other kinds of information from other sources, from police, from other inspectorates that we do not know of. And so what we do is help build up a case for the prosecutor to be able to prosecute and do as much as we can. But yes, there is from the first principally from the first inspection visit, we try to contact the prosecutor if we suspect that there are or if there are indications of labor exploitation that may go as far as human trafficking. So he or she is really the first person to be contacted together with a shelter. And then we hear, and what we try to do in that first contact is to send a photo, and I mean in the broad sense of the word, to picture the situation that we as inspectors find at a workplace, and basically it's a phone call. We call the prosecutor and explain what we are confronted with, and then the first measures are often taken. That's vis-a-vis the victim, but also as far as the investigation is concerned, the prosecutor can order a judicial investigation, and an investigative judge can be involved, so that more severe measures like wiretapping, house searches, etc., can be ordered, and that kind of investigation we then cooperate, but always under the orders of the prosecutor. I don't know if that is an answer to your question.
Thanks. I think it was a comprehensive reply. I think you have a very, as Annina said, a much more structural system in place than we currently have in Finland. So I'm hoping we'll kind of move towards something more similar that you have. I just wanted to mention that there was a very interesting chat discussion on Marius's presentation. And I think the Henning, a labor inspector from the Åland Islands, had a question about the minimum wage and the kind of collective agreement. And then Marius replied that one way is to also make the contracting companies more responsible for what happens in their supply chain. And in the framework of the Flow project, as Annina mentioned, we've also developed a brand new tool with 5 steps for overseeing your supply chain for businesses and also useful for public procurers. And we'll share that to you, all of you, when we share the slides from this set. I think